He started out as just another quiet kid in Chinatown, stuck between tight apartments, low cash, and big dreams that did not match the life around him. Somewhere along the line, that kid flipped the script and turned into the kind of shot caller who could lock down streets, call plays, and make people move without raising his voice. The neighborhood gave him a nickname, and the underworld treated him like a king, while the cops and the feds kept chasing shadows and empty leads. His money looked clean, his power looked untouchable, and when the heat turned up, he did not just run around the corner. He made the whole system come looking for him. This is not just another gang tale. It is the rise, the reign, and the fallout of a Chinatown drug lord. Join us as we follow Onionhead's war with the law. Johnny's story begins in Hong Kong, where he was born to Chinese parents and spent his early childhood before his family decided to gamble on a new life. When he was around 14, in the early 1970s, his parents brought him to the United States and settled in Manhattan's Chinatown. For a lot of families like his, the neighborhood looked like a doorway to the American dream, but it came with cramped apartments, low-paying jobs, and long shifts in garment factories or small shops. Adults took whatever work they could find, often 2 or 3 jobs, just to keep rent paid and food on the table. Young people like Johnny were packed into overcrowded schools where English hit them like a second punch on top of culture shock. The Chinatown blocks were busy and bright from the outside, with neon signs, restaurants, and herbal shops. But beneath that, the place was struggling. Overcrowding, poverty, and a lack of real social support made life rough for immigrant teenagers. A lot of them were left to figure things out on their own while their parents worked late, and the street became the classroom. And that was the world Johnny walked into, one where family pride pushed you to succeed, but the system did not give you many real lanes, especially if you came in speaking little English and carrying the weight of a new world on your back. When Johnny first touched down in New York, he did not dream about being a boss or a DI low. For a while, he wanted something completely different. He looked at American movies, locked onto actors like Mickey Rourke, and pictured himself on the screen instead of the street. He wanted to act, to be the kind of guy people watched in dark theaters instead of being the one they crossed the road to avoid. But dreams do not pay rent in a cramped Chinatown apartment. The neighborhood he moved through was full of young immigrants drifting between cheap arcades, back alley card games, and crowded coffee shops. The same blocks where families tried to keep their heads down were also where hustlers flashed quick cash and cars, where guns and fast money started to look more real than any Hollywood script. The pull of that life was strong, and it did not take long before the boy who wanted to act began playing a different role, one written by the street instead of a studio. By the mid to late 1970s, he had stepped into the game. As a teenager, he started getting picked up by cops for all kinds of street-level trouble. Records later showed that he was arrested at least 5 times in that decade on different criminal charges. The hits on his sheet included assault, possession of a machine gun, and promoting gambling, all tied to action inside Chinatown's tight blocks. These were the kind of charges that told a story without needing a witness. Assault meant he was not afraid to put hands on people. A machine gun case meant he had access to serious heat at a young age, not just pocket pistols, but real war-ready hardware. Promoting gambling meant he was already inside the back rooms, helping keep the games running and the money flowing for older players. None of those early arrests turned into the kind of long sentence that would take him off the board, partly because policing Chinatown was hard in a community that did not trust outside authorities and rarely talked. But each case put a little more weight on his name. It showed that Johnny was not just hanging around the edge of the action. He was learning how the street worked and testing how far he could push before the system really pushed back. To understand why a kid like Johnny slid into that life so quickly, you have to look at what Chinatown was becoming in those years. The old Tongs, groups like On Leong and Hip Sing, had been around for generations. On the surface, they were community associations, business clubs, and social halls. Inside, they also ran gambling houses, controlled vice, and pulled strings that most outsiders never saw. As new waves of immigrants arrived from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Fujian, Vietnam, Laos, and other parts of Asia, the old power map started to crack. Teenagers landed in the middle of that shift. They hung out in association club rooms, near gambling dens, or outside storefronts linked to tongs, and slowly those youth cliques hardened into real gangs. Sociologists studying the area later said it followed a pattern. Adult associations gave kids a place to gather and sometimes put them to work as muscle. Police would arrest these youths and label them as gang members, and the name stuck. The Flying Dragons, the Ghost Shadows, the Fuk Ching, and others all came out of this kind of pressure cooker. One study even called the setup similar to a Cosa Nostra family, where older leaders stayed insulated while young soldiers handled the dirty work on the street. A police officer in New York said that some of these tongs had become a union of generations, with older men pulling money from illegal businesses and younger crews acting as the visible enforcers. In that world, a teenage boy with something to prove did not just join a random crew. He joined a brand with backing, history, and people willing to arm him. The crew that drew Johnny in was the Flying Dragons. They started back in 1967, formed mainly by immigrants from Hong Kong and based in New York City's Chinatown. Over time, they grew into a Chinese-American street gang closely attached to the Hip Sing Tong. What began as youth groups tied to martial arts clubs turned into a structured organization. There were Dai Dai Las at the very top, Dai Las leading factions, street leaders watching corners, and Majayas, the regular foot soldiers. Their core turf sat on streets like Pell, the Bowery, and Grand in Manhattan, where they guarded Hip Sing-linked gambling dens and enforced the Tong's claims over territory. In Queens, they had three main factions: the Chinese Flying Dragons, the Korean Flying Dragons, and a Grand Street crew in Flushing. Later reports said the gang had around 50 to 100 active members, and they began recruiting beyond Cantonese youth, pulling in Korean and Vietnamese teenagers for extra muscle. When Johnny joined as a young man in the late 1970s, he came in at the bottom, working as part of that enforcement arm. He would walk into restaurants and shops with other dragons, collect protection money, and make sure nobody forgot who ran the block. At the same time, he started paying tribute up the chain to older figures in the Chinatown underworld, including Benny Ong, also known as Uncle Benny, who was a key power inside Hip Sing. Those small envelopes going upstairs showed that Johnny understood how to play the long game. He was not just a hot-headed soldier, he was learning how to move like someone who had plans to climb. Around this time, Chinatown was already shaking from another street war that showed how fast a new crew could get erased. In 1982, a Hip Sing member set up a new group called the Kowloon Association and opened a gambling spot on East Broadway. He claimed that stretch as his own territory and started recruiting young men to guard the den, many of them the same kind of kids who might have run with the Flying Dragons. For a minute, Kowloon looked ready to become a serious player. Then, in December of that year, 3 gunmen walked into a bar on East Broadway, where those youths hung out and opened fire. 3 people were killed, 8 more were badly wounded, and the attack became known as the Golden Star Massacre. After that, Kowloon could not regroup. The adult association behind it faded, and the youth crew tied to it died with it. Researchers studying Chinatown gangs later used that story to show how fragile a young set could be if the adult backing was weak. For people like the Flying Dragons, the lesson was clear: if your tongue was strong, you survived. If not, you ended up like Kowloon, history written in blood on a bar floor. Johnny came up during this period, watching which groups fell apart and which ones used violence to lock in their status. Those lessons would matter when the next big power shift hit Hip Sing and the Dragons. The real turning point for Johnny came in 1983. At that time, the top position in the Flying Dragons belonged to Michael Chen. People in Chinatown called him the Scientist because he had a calm, cool style that made him stand out from more flashy gang leaders. That calm did not save him. In the spring of that year, Chen was gunned down in the doorway of the Hip Sing Credit Union. He was hit 14 times, including 4 shots fired straight into his eyes. The message was as brutal as it was clear. Whoever wanted the top seat was willing to go all the way to take it. With Chin dead, the gang had a power vacuum. Different hitters and lieutenants jostled for position, but ultimately Johnny, who had been building his rep inside the Dragons, stepped into that space. Several sources agree that after Chin's murder, Aang took over and became the DEA Low of the Flying Dragons. Overnight, he shifted from being a key enforcer to being the man everyone answered to. The kid, who once dreamed of reading lines on a movie set, was now writing the script for a whole gang, and it was about to turn a lot darker. Once he took the chair, Johnny did not run the Flying Dragons like a loose pack of hotheads. He treated it like an organization. He moved quickly to tighten control, pushing out rivals, testing loyalty, and lining up lieutenants he trusted. One of those players was Michael Yu, also known as Fox, who acted as an underboss and helped run day-to-day operations. At that point, the Dragons had around 100 active members across their factions. With the hip-seeing elders behind him, Johnny used purges and quiet pressure to get rid of suspected informants and troublemakers. If someone was seen as a problem, they could be sidelined or worse. Promotions were tied to money-making jobs, protection rackets, gambling houses, and later drug work. Under his leadership, the Dragons kept their base in Manhattan on Pell Street, the Bowery, and Grand, but they also leaned harder into Queens and other areas where Chinese communities were growing. Manhattan still had the old Tong structure, but places like Flushing were more open. A detective who worked Chinatown called Queens the future and virgin territory. It was, in his words, open for picking. Johnny saw the same thing. The more the Chinese community spread along subway lines, the more space there was for a crew like the Flying Dragons to plant their flag. And with every new block, Johnny's reach grew, setting up the next phase of his power. With Johnny on top, extortion in Chinatown was not random. It was a business model. The Flying Dragons under his watch leaned on restaurants, garment factories, and small stores. Merchants knew the drill. A crew member would walk in, sometimes smiling, sometimes stony-faced, and make it clear that there was a tax to operate in peace. In Queens, the numbers could be around $100 a week. In Manhattan, some places were paying around $600 a month. During Chinese New Year or big festivals, shop owners were pressed again, this time for lucky money, $20 to $50 here and there, all adding up as Johnny's soldiers moved from door to door. Garment shops faced another kind of squeeze. Gangs pushed them to buy low-quality fabric or machinery at high prices, turning even basic supplies into a hustle. A New York police officer later said that one leader of the Flying Dragons was pulling in about $3,400 a week from a single gambling house on Pell Street. That kind of income did not come from kind requests. Enforcers backed up the talk with violence. Owners who refused could find tables flipped, windows smashed, or get punched in front of their customers. The Dragons also went after gamblers leaving high-stake games and customers coming out of massage parlors where Korean women worked, knowing these victims were unlikely to report a stick-up. On top of that, all this street pressure fed into turf wars with rival sets like the Ghost Shadows and later Born to Kill, as crews fought over which gang's name would be whispered in fear on which corner. With his nickname Machine Gun Johnny and a reputation for using automatic weapons, Aang became the face attached to that whole system of fear. While Johnny's Dragons were tightening their grip, the larger Asian gang scene around them was getting even wilder. Vietnamese refugees and other Southeast Asian youths began showing up in Chinatown gangs as muscle. At first, Chinese gangs used them as hitters, calling them in when they needed someone who did not mind kicking in doors or pulling triggers. Some older Chinese players later said these kids were too violent, even by Chinese standards. That edge led them to form their own sets. One of the most feared was Born to Kill, a Vietnamese heavy crew whose name came from the phrase American soldiers used to write on their helmets in Vietnam. By the late 1980s, Born to Kill was clashing with Chinese gangs over turf and extortion routes. One leader of that crew, David Tai, had once been part of the Vietnamese branch of the Flying Dragons, a faction that felt like second class inside the organization. They were treated as coffee boys and given the dirtiest jobs with the highest risk, like robbery and murder, while being cut out of the better money from drug dealing. Tai walked away from that setup in 1987, built Born to Kill, and turned it into a crew that went toe-to-toe with the Flying Dragons and the Ghost Shadows over who controlled Canal Street and other prime spots. At one funeral, for a Born to Kill leader, shooters pulled guns from behind wreaths and sprayed mourners with bullets, wounding many. It was the kind of scene you usually only saw in gangster movies playing at the neighborhood theaters, except this time it was real blood on real streets. All of this chaos made it clear that simple extortion and gambling were no longer enough. The stakes were rising, and the serious bosses were already eyeing a bigger prize. The mid-1980s changed the drug game in New York. The Pizza Connection cases hit the Italian-American mob hard and tore up a big piece of the heroin pipeline. That left open space in the market, and Chinese traffickers moved to fill it. Under Johnny's command, the Flying Dragons shifted from mainly local shakedowns and gambling to building a serious heroin operation. Starting around 1987, Ng coordinated shipments of high-purity heroin from suppliers in Hong Kong and other parts of Asia. The product came into the United States in several ways. Human couriers swallowed pellets and flew through John F. Kennedy International Airport. Other loads came in the mail, hidden inside toys, stuffed animals, steel tubes, and everyday items like bean sprout washing machines. Some parcels were packed with dried peppers and Chinese herbs to throw off drug-sniffing dogs. Prosecutors later tied roughly 228 kilograms of heroin to Ng's network across different shipments in 1987 and 1988. They said about 66 kilograms moved through couriers at the airport, and around 84 kilograms came through 7 different mail parcels, with other loads stacked on top of that. Just one group of intercepted shipments, around 115 kilograms, was estimated to have a wholesale value of about $6 million. Johnny made frequent trips back to Hong Kong, not as a tourist, but as the boss checking in with his plug and moving money. On one visit in September 1987, he reportedly carried around $600,000 in cash, showing just how big the operation had grown. He paid recruiters huge fees and used Flying Dragons members as mules and street-level dealers. Heroin became the real engine behind his power, turning the gang from a local menace into a link in a global chain running straight from the Golden Triangle to the blocks of Chinatown. With that kind of heroin weight moving through his hands, Johnny stopped living like a broke kid from a crowded tenement. People who saw him on the street said he liked to dress sharp, often in a black suit with a red tie, smoking French cigarettes and carrying himself with the calm of someone who knew he had serious backup. The money he made did not just sit in boxes under a mattress. He pushed it into fronts and legit businesses. Some of that cash went into diamond trading and shipping companies that helped him move both goods and money. He also bought real estate. One piece was an $800,000 mansion on Staten Island, a far cry from the cramped Chinatown apartments where his story started. He had a 200-acre estate in Pennsylvania where he and his people could do target practice without neighbors calling the cops. On top of that, he held luxury apartments back in Hong Kong and bought himself a Mercedes-Benz 500 SL, the kind of car that told everyone he had serious paper. He got into private clubs too, like the Clearwater Bay Golf Club, a spot for elites in Hong Kong. All of this built an image of a man who was half street legend, half businessman. To outsiders, he might have looked like a flashy self-made millionaire. To the people on the block, he was the Dai Lo whose crew could squeeze them for cash or flood their neighborhood with dope. To law enforcement, he was no longer just another name on a gang list. He was a high-priority target. By 1988, federal agencies were not guessing about Johnny anymore. They knew his name, his role, and his reach. A confidential Justice Department report ranked him as one of the 5 major heroin dealers in New York City. Another government document on Asian organized crime said flat out that Ng was believed to be one of the most important heroin distributors in the city. They linked him to the Flying Dragons, tied to Hip Sing, operating from Pell and Doyer streets, and even carrying out business in other cities like Dallas, Houston, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. On the street, he was already known as Onionhead and Machine Gun Johnny, labels that matched a bald, rounded head and a reputation for bringing serious firepower when needed. On paper, he became the lead defendant in multiple federal cases. In April 1989, in the Eastern District of New York, a grand jury indicted him for running a continuing criminal enterprise and for 17 separate heroin trafficking offenses connected to the big shipments in 1987 and 1988. Other indictments were waiting for him too, including one in the Southern District of New York and one up in Massachusetts. Prosecutors were not just after his body. They were coming for his money, his houses, and his businesses, using forfeiture laws that let them grab assets tied to drug crime. On every level, street, state, and federal, the heat was coming. The only question now was whether they could catch him before he slid out of reach. By 1989, the net around Johnny in New York was getting tight. The DEA, the FBI, and local cops were all focused on Chinatown, chasing new Chinese smugglers who were bringing in China white heroin from the Golden Triangle and pushing it in bulk. In 2 years, agents seized around 200 pounds of heroin and $25 million in drug-related assets, including restaurants, apartment buildings, and stacks of cash. They were also hitting Asian gangs in Queens, where groups like the Green Dragons and White Tigers were extorting merchants and planning shootouts, seizing Uzis and MAC-10 machine pistols in the process. In Manhattan, prosecutors built cases against Ghost Shadows and other crews using racketeering laws. All across the city, Asian organized crime was no longer something the authorities saw as a side issue. They started talking about these gangs as a threat that might one day rival the mafia at its peak. Inside that storm, Johnny could feel the noose tightening. He knew the feds saw him as more than just a street boss. He was the man at the center of a major heroin pipeline. Staying in New York while multiple indictments stacked up and agents watched every move was not a smart play for a man who had always tried to stay one step ahead. So he did what big bosses often do when the block gets too hot. In 1989, while federal investigations and grand jury papers were stacking up around his name, Johnny decided he was not going to sit in New York and wait for a knock on the door. A native of Hong Kong with deep ties there, he fled back across the ocean before agents could put cuffs on him in New York. On paper, he became a fugitive. In reality, he was a high-level boss trying to use international borders like another layer of protection. But running did not mean he was free. It only changed the rules of the game. In August of that year, acting on a provisional arrest request from U.S. authorities under the old United States, United Kingdom extradition treaty, Hong Kong officers picked him up. The same city that once felt like home now became the stage for the next fight in his story. Johnny did not roll over and accept a quick trip back in chains. Instead, he treated the extradition like another war, this time fought with lawyers instead of guns. Once he was locked in Hong Kong, Johnny turned his drug money into legal firepower. He hired top-notch attorneys, including a specialist based in London, and fought every angle he could. He challenged the use of the US-UK extradition treaty over a Hong Kong-born citizen and refused to sign any affidavit that would make it easier to send him back. The case dragged on, turning into what officials later called one of the longest contested extradition proceedings in Hong Kong history. For more than 2 years, his lawyers raised technical arguments in court, while senior Crown Counsel from the Hong Kong Attorney General's chambers pushed back on behalf of the United States. During that time, almost 27 months, Johnny sat in detention, no longer running Pell street corners or riding through Staten Island, but still trying to play the game the way he always had, staying in motion, looking for an angle, refusing to admit defeat. For Ng, that legal war became the only battlefield he had left, and he treated it like just another high-stakes play. In the end, the walls closed in anyway. Finally, on September 27, 1991, the Hong Kong court ruled him extraditable. This time, he did not appeal. When the fight in Hong Kong finally ended, the game moved back to New York. On November 1st, 1991, after almost 27 months sitting in detention overseas, Hong Kong handed Johnny Ng over to United States Marshals. The man who once walked Pell Street like a shot caller arrived in chains, no crew around him, just officers moving him through airports and locked doors. He was taken straight to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, a place built for high-risk federal defendants. Inside those walls, the DEA Low of the Flying Dragons was no longer the man giving orders. He was just another inmate waiting to find out how hard the system planned to hit him. Prosecutors were ready. They lined up 18 federal counts on him: heroin importation, heroin distribution, conspiracy, and the heavy label of running a continuing criminal enterprise. After all the years Ng had spent dodging raids and sliding across borders, everything he had done in the shadows was now written out in black and white on a charging sheet with his name on top. The trial that followed was not some small local case. It went down in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, the same kind of courtroom that had already chewed up mob bosses and drug lords before him. Starting in December 1992, Ng faced those 18 counts tied to his heroin operation. The charges sat under tough federal drug laws, sections 848, 846, 952A, and 841A1, the kind of statutes built for big traffickers, not street corner dealers. The government called him the boss of a continuing criminal enterprise that had dumped serious weight into American streets and turned Chinatown into a pipeline for high-grade heroin. When trials started, prosecutors did not lean on rumors or street talk. They brought people from Ng's own circle to the stand and let them talk. And one of the loudest voices was a woman named Wah Tom Lee, who had gone from dealing cards in a Flying Dragons gambling spot on Pell Street to moving dope for the boss. She told the jury she had not started out as a player at all. She was just deep in trouble, sitting on a gambling debt of around $20,000. Her boyfriend, Michael Yu, a key lieutenant for Ng, pulled her into the heroin game so she could work that debt off. According to Lee, Ng paid her $50,000 for each big run she helped set up through John F. Kennedy International Airport in 1987, using couriers flying in from Hong Kong with heroin strapped to their bodies, while she met them, collected the packages, and funneled the weight back into Ng's hands. She said Ng even flew her and Yu to Hong Kong to meet his supplier, a man named Ming, and had them smuggle more than $500,000 in hidden cash to keep the pipeline open, then sent them on an all-expense-paid Club Med trip to Indonesia as his twisted way of saying thank you. From there, Lee and other witnesses like Gwendolyn Chan and Kathy Leung laid out the quieter male side of the hustle, where parcels came in from Hong Kong stuffed with toys, tea boxes, and bags of peppers and spices, and where opening the tea boxes meant finding 7-kilogram loads of heroin tucked inside. Under Ng's orders, Lee and Yu pushed that dope out to buyers like a man named Lap, or sold parts of it to people such as Ching Yi Chen when the boss gave the green light. When customs agents finally intercepted one of the later packages and turned it into a controlled delivery, they grabbed a courier named Gwendolyn Chan, who flipped and led them to Leung, and Leung's cooperation helped bring down Lee, Yu, and Tina Wong in early 1988. Agents also showed the jury how far Ng and his crew would go to hide their product, pointing to a so-called bean sprout washing machine that looked like regular kitchen hardware, but actually held a stash of heroin sealed inside steel tubes like something straight out of a crime flick. Outside the courtroom, the picture was just as loud. Reporters were already calling Ng the John Gotti of Chinatown, the kind of boss who walked through his neighborhood like a celebrity and a threat at the same time. A New York Times piece from 1989 had talked about how Ng was trying to pass himself off as a legitimate businessman, moving like he was clean with houses, cars, and clubs, while the authorities watched from the sidelines knowing better. Federal agents said that most of the heroin hitting New York at that time, around 70%, came from Chinese crews linked to Southeast Asia, and Ng had turned his product into a brand by using the street name China White for the heroin his people were pushing. That move forced the Drug Enforcement Administration to build a special task force just for Chinatown, a crew of agents with the language skills and local knowledge who could actually follow what was happening inside closed doors. They called that team Group 41, and it was led by Richard LaMagna, a former deputy chief of the DEA. Group 41 used undercover stings and patient tracking to go after the Chinatown gangs, especially Ng, and at one point they grabbed more than $60 million worth of heroin. By the time Johnny sat in front of the jury, he was not just another case file, he was a symbol. The Chinatown drug lord who had once made the feds look slow, now sitting in their courtroom while they tried to return the favor. You might think a man facing life behind bars would sit stiff and silent, but witnesses in the gallery told a different story. One article from that time carried a headline that hit hard: "Heroin suspect laughs at trial." In that piece, reporters said Ng showed no real fear as the weeks rolled by. While the mountain of evidence stacked up, Ng sat next to his lawyer, Gerald Chargell, the same defense attorney who had worked on John Gotti's cases, and he smiled. At times he even laughed, like the whole thing was a bad joke he had already heard before. Judge Rena Raggi did not like that. At one point, she straight up reprimanded him in open court for mocking a witness. Prosecutors said he was facing life in prison without parole if the jury believed their story. Chargell pushed back, attacking the snitches on the stand, pointing out that they were trying to save their own skin by dragging Ng's name into everything. It turned the trial into a showdown. The government leaned heavy on the people who had done the dirty work for Ng, and those stories cut through his calm face in the jury's eyes. By the time all those names were read and all those deals were explained, the jury had a clear picture of a structure. After weeks of testimony and days of legal back and forth, the jury finally went behind closed doors to decide if the man the papers call Onionhead was just a fall guy or the real brain behind the heroin pipeline. They took their time, thinking it through over several days. On December 14th, 1992, they came back with their answer. The jury convicted Ng on 14 of the counts against him, including the heavy ones tied to importing and distributing more than 400 pounds of heroin and running a continuing criminal enterprise. He beat a few of the charges. 4 counts did not stick, but that did not change what really mattered. Those 14 guilty verdicts were enough to lock him into a long stretch and to put a federal label on his role as a Chinatown drug lord. Prosecutors said in plain terms that this was not just about a few scattered deals. In their eyes, the jury had agreed that Ng was the boss of a multi-million-dollar heroin ring that reached from Hong Kong ports to New York mailrooms and airport bathrooms. Whatever smile he had flashed earlier in the trial, this was the moment where the game shifted for good. He was no longer the die low fighting to beat a case. He was a convicted kingpin waiting to hear how many years the judge was about to drop on his head. That answer came a few months later. In March 1993, Judge Rena Raggi handed down the sentence that would define the next chapter of Ng's life. She gave him 24 years in federal prison. On the technical side, that meant concurrent terms of 292 months on the main drug counts and 151 months on the continuing criminal enterprise count, but the message was simple. He was not walking out free for a very long time. On top of the time, the judge hit him with a fine of $3.5 million and ordered that his assets from the heroin empire be forfeited. That included big ticket pieces like his house on Staten Island and the estate in Newfoundland, Pennsylvania. Prosecutors later said that more than $1.5 million in assets had already been taken as part of the case. There was even a story that Ng had been so sure the jury would clear him that he had arranged for a special Peking duck dinner to celebrate his expected release, a dinner that had to be canceled the moment that guilty verdict landed. Behind that sentence sat a cold calculation that came not from the street, but from the sentencing guidelines. The judge did not just pick a number out of the air. She looked at how much heroin the court believed had actually moved through Ng's operation. For the substantive drug counts, the total weight used at sentencing was 228 kilograms. Ng had been acquitted on the actual washing machine count, But the judge was allowed to look at that weight under sentencing rules that use any conduct proven by a lower standard than beyond a reasonable doubt. The base offense level for that much heroin was already high. And then the court added 4 more levels because Ng was found to be a leader, the one running at least 5 other people in a serious drug business. When that adjusted level for the regular drug counts ended up higher than the level for the continuing criminal enterprise charge, the guidelines told the judge to use the higher number. On the street, none of that math mattered. What mattered was that the man who had once been called one of the most important heroin distributors in New York now had a number on his back that would keep him locked down long enough to make him vanish from the daily life of Chinatown. Even after the sentence dropped, Ng did not just sit quietly and accept his fate. His legal team took the case to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, arguing that the trial judge had pushed his punishment too far. One of his main complaints was not about the prison time, but about what would happen after it. Judge Raggi had added a lifetime term of supervised release to his sentence on some of the drug counts. That meant that even after doing years behind bars, he would stay on paper under federal watch for the rest of his life. Ng's lawyers argued that this went beyond what the law allowed. They pointed to a general supervised release statute that set 5 years as the maximum term for serious felonies and said that the judge had crossed that line. They also tried to challenge how the sentencing rules had been used, especially the extra hit for his leadership role when he was already convicted of running a continuing criminal enterprise, which itself assumed he was a boss. It was one more attempt to shave down the time and the control the government held over him. One more swing at a system that had finally managed to pin him in place after years of cat and mouse. In 1994, the appeals court gave its answer. The judges were not interested in undoing the foundation of the case. They upheld Ng's convictions in full. They did not tear down the prison term either. On that front, the sentence stood, but the judges did look closely at the supervised release part of the punishment. They decided that the life terms of supervised release on those specific counts went beyond the statutory limit and had to be reduced. So they sent the case back down to the trial court with instructions to fix that part, capping supervised release on those counts at the maximum of 5 years while leaving the main prison term untouched. For Ng, it was a small win inside a much bigger loss. His world was still going to be measured in years behind razor wire. But the idea of the government watching him for life on every piece of his sentence was at least partly rolled back by judges looking at the fine print. After the appeal dust settled, Ng moved deeper into the federal prison system. He had already done around 2 years locked up in Hong Kong between 1989 and 1991, and that time counted toward his total. The rest of the years played out across different federal facilities after his stint at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. From 1993 onward, Ng's life shrank to cell blocks, prison yards, and the small privileges given to inmates who stayed out of trouble. Court records and public reports do not show big disciplinary incidents tied to his name during those years. No major riots, no fresh conspiracies on the outside pinned to him. For a man who once ran a gang that shook down most of Chinatown, his prison record looked surprisingly quiet. It was like he had turned down the volume in there, staying low-key while the world that used to fear his nickname kept changing without him. As the calendar flipped forward, the dope wars shifted. New crews rose and fell, and the memory of Onionhead as an active shot caller started to fade from the street and move into stories and case files. In the end, the total time Ng actually sat in United States custody ended up shorter than the raw 24-year number on his sentence. Once his time in Hong Kong was counted and good behavior credits were applied, he served around 17 years inside American prisons. On November 8th, 2010, he walked out of federal custody, a free man on paper, but not completely free because of that supervised release. That meant he was supposed to stay in line, report to his probation officer, avoid contact with known criminals, and live where the authorities could find him. The fine and the hit from asset forfeiture also did not just disappear when he stepped through the gate. Any attempt to move money or start official businesses in the United States would bump up against the fact that the government had already tagged him as someone whose past profit came from heroin. For a man who once used houses, estates, and companies as both trophies and tools, the world he was released into was a lot smaller and a lot more controlled than the one he had left behind in the late 1980s. If the government expected Ng to play by all those rules for the rest of his supervision term, they misread the man they were dealing with. Not long after his release, he slipped out of their sight again. Reports said he moved back to China and started doing business with another former Flying Dragons member, a man who had himself been deported after doing time. If that was true, it almost certainly meant Ng had broken the conditions of his supervised release, which barred him from leaving the country and from linking back up with known criminals. On paper, that was a violation. In reality, chasing an aging ex-kingpin on the other side of the world was not the easiest move for U.S. authorities. As the years rolled by, there were no fresh public cases filed against him in American courts, no new indictments tied to his name. He simply faded from the official record and from the streets of New York. For people in Chinatown, the name Onionhead became less about a man they could bump into in person and more like a ghost story. The legend of a boss who had beaten the system for years, lost to it for a long stretch, and then somehow managed to slip away again when the gates finally opened. Even as Ng stayed out of sight, the city he'd left behind could not just erase his era. Chinatown had always been a place with a double face, bright festivals and busy shops on one side, and a long history of tongs, street gangs, and underground money on the other. The reign of the Flying Dragons under his command became one of the most talked about chapters in that second story. People remembered how during his peak, Ng's name was spoken in the same breath as the biggest gangsters in the city. Behind the headlines and the gang stories, there was also the quiet life that most people did not see. During the early 1990s, while Ng was being chased, extradited, and tried, he was also a husband and a father. He was married to a woman named Lori Ng, and together they had 2 young children. They co-owned property in New York, and for a while their names sat side by side on paperwork for the same homes that prosecutors later seized or traced in court. Public details about how that family lived day to day are thin because Ng kept his home life in the shadows while his gang life sat in the spotlight. When he went away on the 24-year sentence, Lori was left to raise their children without him, handling the weight of his long bid while also dealing with the stigma of being tied to a man the media called the John Gotti of Chinatown. As he did his time in different prisons, there were no big interviews or emotional statements from her in the press. The family stayed mostly silent, keeping their pain and their problems behind closed doors as the city moved on to new crime stories and new faces in the underworld. Then, not long after Ng finally stepped back into the free world, another tragedy hit that family with brutal force. On July 13, 2011, less than a year after his release, Lori was at her home on 56th Road in Flushing, Queens. She was 51 years old. That day, a man named David Chea showed up at the house. He was 55, an acquaintance from Manhattan, and he had become obsessed with her. Police later said he had been watching the home for months while she spent time in China, tracking her movements like a stalker instead of a friend. At around 5:10 p.m., an argument broke out between them inside the house. It got heated, and then it turned deadly. Chea pulled a .38 caliber pistol, aimed at Lori, and shot her twice in the chest. She died there in the place that was supposed to be her safe space, far from the old gang corners and courtrooms. Chea then took the same gun, walked outside and shot himself once in the head, collapsing on the driveway. Both of them were pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives ruled it a murder-suicide driven by his personal fixation on her, not part of any bigger gang plot or organized crime hit. For neighbors in that quiet Flushing block, it was a shock. They saw police tape and flashing lights in front of a home they thought belonged to just another family, not to the former wife of a man whose name used to echo through Chinatown. What made Lori's death even heavier was the timing. A woman who had carried Ng's last name through the worst years of his life was killed right when most families would hope to rebuild. Media reports noted that Chea had loose ties to the old Flying Dragons world, but investigators could not find any evidence of that. It was not a bullet from a rival crew or a revenge hit tied to some unpaid drug debt. Ng himself did not speak publicly about what happened. No big statement, no on-camera breakdown, nothing to show how the man once called Machine Gun Johnny reacted when gunfire took someone close to him, far from the old battlefields where he used to move. By the time all that played out, the legend of Onionhead had stretched from Hong Kong streets to Chinatown corners, from a federal courtroom to a quiet house. And even now, with Ng living far from New York and the Flying Dragons no longer running Pell Street like they once did, his name still raises one big question in the minds of anyone who studies Chinatown's underworld. How do you really judge a man who built his empire by outsmarting the cops, only to watch the fallout hit everyone around him long after his own run was technically over? In the end, Johnny Ng's story does not land on a clean lesson or a neat, happy ending. The kid who came from Hong Kong chasing a better life turned himself into the top dog of a Chinatown crew that flooded New York, lived like a high roller, and stayed one move ahead of the law until the feds finally locked him down. So where does a story like that really end? And what does it leave behind? A Chinatown kingpin who outplayed cops and agents for years, lost his empire, walked out of prison, and still left blood and damage in his shadow long after the game was supposed to be over. When you look at someone like Onionhead, are you seeing a mastermind, a monster, or a broken mix of both shaped by crowded buildings, fast money in a neighborhood that let gangs move like royalty? If you had been a young kid in that same Chinatown, no English, no cash, and crews waving quick money in your face, what path would you have taken? When the game finally comes back around on a man like this, do you think a prison sentence is enough payment? Or does the street keep paying that debt for years? And after everything you have heard, would you call his story a success, a tragedy, or a warning shot for anyone who still thinks the life only ends two ways? Let us know what you think in the comments box below. And if you liked how we presented you this video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.